By 4 a.m., enormous changes had occurred all throughout the Lawton-Fort Sill battle space. As by this point in the battle at 4, an air assault operation carried out by the incoming reinforcing 77th Special Operations Brigade of the 77th Group Army had sent its first arriving battalions by air, with one of 2 battalions mostly having had pulled off the air assault operation that captured the Henry Army Airfield before the rest of it had been flown in increments, as the 2nd Battalion was being flown in by the time of 4 a.m. with its last arriving company making it into the area in conjunction with even the helos of the 77th Aviation Brigade of the 2 transport helicopter battalions having stopped to pick up a few platoons of FPV drone operators and robotics operators with their quad-legged robots to fly them in to bolster the perimeter defenses that had been begun to be established by the 2 battalions of special operator combat forces that were already holding the airfield and trying to begin to strengthen its perimeter defenses. The airfield had been captured from one company of the 1st of the 354th MP Battalion, having had been softened up substantially by airstrikes from the Su-34 squadron of 12 aircraft, 4 of these aircraft having been directly diverted to hit the area immediately within vicinity of the airfield in conjunction with the 616th Strategic Missile Forces Brigade, a actual Trojan unit in eastern Texas, having fired DF-15Bs and DF-21As all throughout the installation, which even included in and around the airfield, including the building, as does the trainees of the one-station unit training forces, which were in different levels of different rotations as it pertained to the different batteries of 13 Bravo MOS or Cannoneer MOSs that were going through different phases of their training. Some batteries further along in their training than were others, which would figure into their planned counterattack against the airfield being put together by the officers and cadre of the earlier training basic trainee elements that were at the innermost training ranges in the north of the installation, training on different types of training, including even cruiser weapons such as the M250 Cal and Mark 19 belt-fed 40mm grenade launching system, which was essentially like a belt-fed grenade machine gun. These trainees would be utilized in the counterattack as the KG-600 jamming pod-equipped heavy strategic bomber aircraft, 2 of which of the attacking original bomber squadron, 7 of which with 1 attacking Shepherd earlier with another diverted to aid in this assault, now having turned back to head back to Mexico in an RTB, or return to base to refuel and rearm, radio communications had been therefore temporarily restored, allowing surviving elements of the 1st of the 354th MP Battalion, in addition to the trainees, which had been deemed such low priority they hadn't have even been mass attacked until now, apart from their billeting facilities, which there were a few hundred eliminated in those cruise and ballistic missile strikes coming from the 616th and the cruise missile strikes from the container-based YJ-18C/Club K systems. Mostly, until this point, they had stayed out of the way, as at the opening of the actual battle here, which started an hour and 40 minutes after the whole invasion began, with the aircraft arriving, jamming their radios, they had opted to stay out of the way as a PLA mechanized infantry battalion of the 2 that entered the city to capture a large segment of I-44 running through it, was diverted up the interstate where it exited to hit the outer flanks of the 75th, and now that it was advancing away and their communications were restored, they began to concoct a scheme to attempt to retake the airfield. And even as this was going on, the last bits of the combat against the surviving tiny platoon-sized or even squad-sized elements attempting to retreat from the installation that weren't completely encircled earlier and destroyed by the reinforcing 2 recon battalions of armed reconnaissance helos and 2 attack helo battalions of the coming from the 77th Aviation Brigade of the 77th Group Army in conjunction with the Armored Battalion of the 181st Combined Arms Brigade and a different Mechanized Infantry Battalion of that same brigade having moved in to attack the westernmost main post. They were now moving up to surround and destroy these retreating elements with a fresh salvo of CH-901A loitering munitions fired in support of them, along with the helos and armored forces of the Type 99A main battle tank companies of the Armored Battalion, their QN 506 Specialty Anti-Tank Vehicle Company of the battalion, as well as the Armored Infantry of the Armored Battalion and Mechanized Infantry of the whole Mechanized Infantry Battalion, surrounding these retreating elements to destroy them, while still receiving ample artillery support in the process, as indicated by these dashed arrow lines hitting these forces, which consisted of the very tiny remains of the 2nd of the 2nd, most of which had been surrounded and annihilated, with barely a platoon escaping of its headquarters battery or headquarters and support battery of the battalion, with its firing batteries completely destroyed in the encirclement, with a headquarters element of the 1st of the 30th trying to escape, and most of the 2nd of the 6th Air Defense Artillery Schoolhouse Battalion, which was on the installation to train troops in the use of air defense weaponry. They were being encircled now as they tried to flee, and encircled by the armor, the tanks and armored infantry and other assets, and attack and armed recon helos still operating in the area, now moving back and forth in shuttles as they had to return for fuel to their bivouac supply area outside of Wichita Falls, which was originally established by their ground-based elements of that brigade during that battle that finished up there. As that battle had finished just after 2 a.m., the road-based elements of the Special Operations Forces, being 4 whole battalions, the headquarters battalion, which operated the entire brigade's ground vehicles, driving up 2 operator battalions of combat battalions of Special Operators, and their heavy special weapons battalion, which had arrived just as the second shuttling of troops was occurring to continue dropping off the 2 full battalions at the Henry Army Airfield, as the first handful of battalions had captured the airfield from the small group of MPs, which were badly destroyed by Su-34 strikes, as the heavy strategic bomber aircraft had been used against units in the northwest of the installation, as well as against the 75th and the visiting 15th Sustainment Brigade and 1st Armored Division's Divisional Artillery Brigade, whose last units at the time of the fighting around the Henry Army Airfield were still resisting against the Combat Engineer Battalion, originally having taken part in the capture of the southeast corner airfield, as well as fighting off 4 battalions with ample heavy air support provided by H-6Ks, as shown in the previous video, as well as the 2 battalions from the 15th Sustainment that were training at the time with them when the battle kicked off. Now these 5 combat companies of combat engineers were striking from the northeast to the southwest to finish off the headquarters of headquarters battery of the 1st Armored Division's Divisional Artillery Brigade and the 4th of the 27th, which was an M109A6 Paladin-based artillery battalion, and another one in the form of the 2nd of the 3rd. Also included in this fresh attack was the 2 combat battalions of engineers that had actually captured the airfield itself, leaving the headquarters company with the 2 companies that attacked to the west, direct west, while the other 5 attacked from the north east to the southwest from that battalion, leaving only the headquarters company at their command post at the airfield. As this was going on, they were being supported by artillery strikes, as our massive artillery strikes were still supporting the cleaning up of this massive area that had once been the 75th's positions, as the Mechanized Infantry Battalion and the 6 different combat engineer battalions tasked with maintaining this line of contact were now moving in and pursuing, along with artillery support, these remnants of these battalions that had been badly shaken up and destroyed, resulting in mixed unit fighting where very small platoon and rarely company-sized elements continued to attempt to put up token resistance and counterattacks against the pursuing combat engineers and even mechanized infantry troops that came from the battalion that initially seized the interstate with another battalion that was still present in the city, with the Special Operations forces from the ground, and more to be arriving by air to reinforce them, as the last 2 battalions would be air shuttled in as the ground forces arrived and seized control of this area. As the last flight of the last battalion, as the whole 1st Battalion and most of the 2nd were at the Henry Army Airfield by this point, the last flight of troops would come in with 1 company of this last battalion, while the rest were bringing in the first companies of this 1st Battalion of the other 2 out of the 2 total, and would drop them off at about 4:30 after a series of 2 attacks that failed completely, one from 50 troops of the remaining MP forces and another carried out by 200 trainees and cadre, had been fended off by the Special Operators and completely destroyed, leaving only 300 remaining MPs of the 1st of the 354th Battalion, as well as 900 remaining trainees in this particular area that would attempt to carry out a fairly large attack against the airfield in the form of 900 troops and cadre combined. Now, as this was occurring, the buildings, again, of the basic trainees, their billeting structures and battery structures, were all destroyed by cruise missiles in the form of the container-launched YJ-18Cs and Club Ks, as well as also tactical ballistic missiles from the 616th Strategic Missile Forces, whether DF-15B or DF-21As, and limited strikes from some Su-34 aircraft, and limited artillery strikes, at least in this area here, while heavier artillery strikes have been going on throughout the rest of the installation earlier in the battle, and still ongoing again against the remnants of all of these different combat units, which are deemed much higher priority. Although such was the case, 1 battery out of 1 of the 2 howitzer battalions of PLL 66 152mm howitzers would give its support to the Special Operators holding the defensive perimeter. And although construction on the defenses began immediately after the first companies seized control in the air assault operation, they were unable to fully complete their defensive perimeter defenses, although they were still able to construct some carefully laid minefields. Although there wasn't a continuous minefield like originally planned, they had laid an ample amount of anti-personnel mines in the form of Type 72A anti-personnel mines, as well as digging quickly between a lot of different troops digging in concert. They were able to dig a relatively decent number of foxhole machine gun positions that would be staffed by squads of troops with both a heavy W85 12.7mm machine gun on tripods and also a Type 67, which was a general purpose machine gun, which was a smaller caliber than was the much heavier W85 12.7. This one being a 7.62 by 54mm, not the 39 7.62 by 39 that was often attributed to the AKM and AK-47 and Type 56 rifles, and similar, but the longer 7.62 by 54, which was a general purpose machine gun round, often found in the tank coax machine guns as well, operated by both China and Russia and others. These forces provided ample interlocking fields of fire between all their various foxholes as constructed by the different forces of these two battalions around the entire fairly large perimeter, which was 1 mile east to west and over 2 miles north to south. We go to a segment that shows half of the northern perimeter, as this segment in and of itself of this larger battle being carried out is occurring at 4:30 with the first two attacks that were attempted by the MPs and the first batch of recruits and cadre, which was originally intended to be a recon-in-force attack but was utterly parried and destroyed by the Special Operators, to be followed up by the larger attack of 900 troops and cadre, had already occurred between the 200 troops and cadre doing their recon-in-force and an attack by the MPs, which had basically, by this point, just finished being fended off, as the very first moves of this map segment are 4 artillery strikes from 4 different howitzers of the firing battery giving support to these special operators, as the artillery had to pick up the slack for all of the aircraft leaving to do an RTB to get fuel and rearm and conduct any needed maintenance, as again, these aircraft had to fly vast distances, so there were naturally going to be windows of time where, albeit small, but there were going to be windows of time where they weren't currently available. The artillery picked up their slack and was still firing on the main combat unit's remains in support of the other ground troops, while these forces were deemed a much lower priority, and therefore just one battalion was given over to support the special operators, as it was believed they could take care of themselves, which they very well easily could, as they even had their own fire support in the form of light artillery, in the form of 82mm mortars fired from their own heavy/special weapons battalion, which even sent in some forward deployed robot and FPV drone operators to give direct support in this perimeter battle, as they'd been attacked already by 200 trainees and cadre, which they defeated, and MPs. It was decided to, with this last flight worth of a company, the last company of the 2nd Battalion that was flown in after this first one that seized the airfield, with the rest of it coming in, the 2nd Battalion was finally finished being brought in with this last flight at 4:30, in addition to stopping and scooping up some robots and robot operators, and also roughly a platoon-sized force of FPV drone operators, or about 5 total different squads of FPV drone operators. And 3 of them would be pictured in this segment, as they were going to respond directly to this attack carried out by the trainees and cadre, as again, the trainees were in different phases of their training, and therefore the attack was coordinated by the Americans based upon this. And as they had temporarily regained their radio operating abilities, this didn't matter really at all, although it did allow for them to better coordinate their attack. In the grand scheme of things, it didn't matter, because by this point, even with the KG-600 equipped H-6Ks having turned back many minutes ago and left the area, these forces were at such a major disadvantage with all of the installation's heavy firepower vehicles, like the rocket vehicles in the form of the M270 MLRS vehicles, the HIMARS vehicles, the short-range and long-range air defense equipment in the form of Patriots, and even the SHORAD IM systems of the visiting 4th of the 60th Battalion, which belonged to the Divisional Artillery Brigade of the 1st Armored Division, and the other howitzers being completely obliterated by this point, essentially all that was left to deal with for the Chi-Coms was just ground troops, as there were very little vehicles remaining, except for the training vehicles being utilized by the now moving in trainee forces and cadre of those who were training at the innermost training areas right here and just directly to the east of I-44. So they were training at the time when the battle began, and after this segment of highway was captured, the mech infantry passed by them. But by then, as the bombers entered the area with the jamming pods, they were unable to use their communications at the time. So they decided not to risk it, as all they were trainees and cadre. They decided not to risk an attack, as a cadre member deployed from a Gator all-terrain vehicle that was moving in this area had stopped and hidden in foliage to observe the very powerful mechanized infantry forces with all their combat vehicles moving into this area to attack the 75th in conjunction with the combat engineers coming in from the southeast to do the same, with them taking this flank. But now that they moved even further to the northeast to pursue the tiny remains of the 75th, they were now freed up to move back into their battery area, only to return into the more built-up areas of the main post to find it completely shattered by different missile and some artillery strikes and even air attacks from the Su-34s that had earlier on hit this area with a humongous array of very potent munitions types, as the heavy strategic bomber aircraft were doing strategic raids against the main combat units, including in the northwest part of the post against these training units that still had access to relatively heavy equipment, leaving the Su-34s to handle this central part of the main post on both sides of the interstate. As they returned, they only had very limited logistics in the form of their training ammunition that they originally were intending to use on training, but now had to deploy to try to counterattack and recapture the Henry Army Airfield in the vain imagination of the cadre to be able to then use it for resupply and reinforcements, because they believed, and believed wrongly, falsely, that not all of America was undergoing an invasion, whereas the actual truth said the opposite, as every American installation was now being overrun by coalition troops, and there was only a small handful that hadn't, but even those that hadn't been immediately overrun yet had been so heavily hit by air and missile strikes that they ceased to even be able to function as an actual installation, as all the vehicles that were upon those not immediately overran were completely destroyed in these attacks. One such instance being the attack against Holoman Air Base in New Mexico. It was so badly pummeled by tactical ballistic and cruise missiles, and also air raids, that by the time the advancing forces belonging to the external prong in that area, the 14th PLA Group Army and its PAP counterparts in the form of the 18th Light Armored Brigade, moved into that area essentially to do a battle damage assessment, as there was no resistance in that area. They moved in to find a cratered, pockmarked, smoking mess, as they dispatched a battalion from the interstate to check the installation, make sure that there were no combat elements whatsoever at all remaining upon it to even be able to challenge occupation in the area that would come from the Pakistanis as they would travel to the north upon taking full control over the El Paso Fort Bliss area, which was to the south of the Holoman Air Base, and thus they continued their advance north. But as that was one example of a heavily pummeled installation that was checked a bit later, this installation was completely being overrun. And as they tried to challenge the forces holding the airfield at the Henry Army Airfield, they falsely assumed that the Chinese forces holding the airfield were light infantry and weren't actual Special Operations Forces, and Special Operations Forces that had ample combat experience, with many having rotated through other PLA units such as the Night Tigers and others that had been deployed to the Syrian civil war and widely used in several deployments, as stated in many articles on the subject. And as their recon-in-force was defeated with relative ease, as this only involved 2 companies' worth of trainees and cadre, they decided there was no other choice remaining but to launch their attack against the airfield, their main attack, using 900 trainees and cadre in different capacities, with the least trained trainees being sent in human wave assaults as diversionary attacks or attacks trying to utilize strength in numbers, as they didn't have formal tactical training in certain combat formations, such as wedge or staggered column or regular column, double column. They were just learning these things and were not trusted to be used in that capacity. Whereas classes that were further along in their one-station unit training or basic training, they were the ones trusted with carrying out the main tactical aspects of this battle, along with the fire support coming from the dedicated cadre operating these crew-serve weapons to support their trainees attacking with their small arms. The attack was doomed to failure from the start, but it had to be attempted because, again, it was motivated by an urge by the officers and cadre seeing some kind of hope, especially now that their radio communications temporarily came back for a short period, now that the KG-600 jamming pod-equipped bombers had left the area, and unbeknownst to them, they saw a small glimmer of hope that if they conducted a counterattack and retook Henry, that forces from other installations would possibly be able to resupply them at the very bare minimum, or reinforce them, or pull them out altogether. But this was, again, not the case, as every installation was being overrun, and a very small handful that weren't were totally missiled into oblivion, out of existence. So, in their hope of either resupply, reinforcement, or extraction, they decided to launch their ill-fated main attack. As this map segment, which only shows part of the airfield area, with a half a mile of the whole airfield off the map of the perimeter, with the rest of it on this 2-mile by single-mile map segment, as these last heliborne elements in their Z-20 utility helicopters now landed with their troops being disembarked of this last full company of the other battalion on the other side of this perimeter, because both battalions at the time of this landing, both battalions were now in full in the area, in addition to armed robots in the form of the heavy or special weapons battalions, several robotic sections that were sent to bolster the defenses in this area, and FPV drone operators in the form of one full platoon of FPV drone operators that were forward deployed in order to tailor to the needs of this specific defense force that had essentially conducted this perimeter around the airfield and built it up with the anti-personnel mines. Although they couldn't have a continuous minefield as the time didn't exist to plant all their mines, they were still able to plant sections of minefields in different areas around the whole perimeter, including in this specific smaller area, which only shows half of the northern perimeter, with the other half off map held by the other battalion of the two, with this specific segment here only showing 3 full companies of the 1st Battalion, which initially seized the airfield, holding this side of the airfield. And here, off the map, were hundreds of other trainees and cadre launching the southern portion of the attack. As again, this is only a segment of the larger battle occurring. In this segment, most of the battle launched by the cadre and trainees is occurring, but there was still much more going on off, as The forces are split roughly half and half, with this portion having slightly more, as there are 550 trainees in this area, and of course there's 350 to the south in the smaller segment of one more half mile of the perimeter around the airfield. And in this northern part here, an earlier attack by MPs occurred slightly to the west of here, where this being a pinprick attack with one platoon of MPs attempting to attack through this wooded area and from these buildings firing through, but they were seen by ISR assets in the form of the quadcopter reconnaissance drones, as were the forces moving into the area of the rest of the trainees and cadre, not counting the first 200, which were spotted and fire missions called in upon them by the artillery, struck and destroyed, with very few even making it to be cut down by the heavy machine guns and lighter squad level machine guns and general purpose machine guns of these ordinary combat forces of special operations troops, not counting their arriving FPV drone assets from the heavy weapons battalion from one of those companies, and also a robotics platoon from that same company, leaving the mortar forces still at the northeastern portion of the Lawton Fort Sill Regional Airport, as the heavy weapons battalion had moved into that area and set up. And they didn't quite have time to send in the rest of the company they only had time to send in the FPV drone platoon and the platoon of robotics operators by helicopter, as the rest of their forces were massing in the northeast corner at the time this attack was actually launched. And again, his artillery was so heavily fixated on other combat units that took way higher priority than these trainees, as they were kind of seen as a joke, including up here against these training cadre of these other forces that were hit by the armored battalion and mechanized infantry battalion of this force earlier, and also pursuing forces, as well as a separate battalion that had finished with the 5th of the 5th and circled and destroyed the headquarters of headquarters battery of the 428th Training Brigade. These special forces were only given one single battery from two of the closest howitzer battalions of 152 millimeter howitzers, whereas the rest of the 152 batteries and the 155 batteries, which also consisted of two, were firing at these forces on this part of the map mostly, and some at the surviving remains of these forces that hadn't been completely surrounded yet, but were beginning to be by the helicopters of the attack helicopter battalions, the two armed recon, and the two attack, in support of the ground forces in the form of their Type 99A main battle tanks, QN-506 specialty anti-tank vehicles that comprised the Armored Battalion's anti-tank company, the armored infantry, which were essentially mechanized infantry, including the whole mechanized infantry battalion that wasn't part of the armored battalion, which had its own mechanized infantry called armored infantry. These being Type 79A main battle tanks, also being supported by a freshly fired salvo of CH-901A loitering munitions from the 181st Combined Arms Brigade's own headquarters battalion and its dedicated drone sections, just as the headquarters battalion that arrived in Fort Sill was now firing its own support-based drone support from CH-901As in conjunction with the FPV drones that were being operated by the 5 FPV drone sections of the whole FPV drone platoon that was forward deployed to the airfield itself. So there was two different types of kamikaze drones, essentially, in other words. The quadcopter variety with a heavy explosive charge, and then HE warhead-mounted CH-901As, which were like the best of both worlds as it pertained to the fragmentation option warheads, or the HE-AT warheads, or the heat warheads, which were high explosive anti-tank warheads. The heat warheads were best used against armored vehicles, although they could eliminate ground troops, obviously, but the fragmentation was definitely the best for that job. But the HE, or high explosive warheads, were a mix between both, as in they were the best of both worlds, as in you could destroy a relatively lighter armored vehicle with an HE-1 warhead, and you could also destroy ground troops. And whereas the fragmentation focused mostly on ground troops, although it could destroy light-skinned vehicles, and the heavy armored vehicles were hit by heat, which were the best against them for obvious reasons, against tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and vehicles like that. But a heat-armed warhead was enough to destroy an MRAP from the top, from coming down on its roof, and could destroy any vehicles that were definitely lighter than an MRAP as well, especially even ground troops. So these HE-equipped CH-901As were fired by the headquarters platoon of the Special Operations Company that had arrived on the ground with carrying two additional, as it was responsible for driving the whole brigade's vehicles of the Special Operations Brigade. It drove in with the Heavy Weapons Battalion and 2 operator battalions, with the last 2 being flown into the airport as reinforcements for the forces that came in by ground, with the first of the brigade that arrived being these 2 battalions by air, by their air assault operation and subsequent flights bringing in the rest of those forces. So what happened was, now that they flew into a softened up area, built up some defenses in the short time they had to do so, they had emplaced the beginnings of some anti-personnel minefields, they had dug foxhole-like machine gun emplacements with interlocking fields of fire, and these neighborhoods of houses, these were on-base housing, they were smashed for a few reasons, not only because they were the homes of personnel, of troops that worked on the installation, but they were also currently being occupied on the streets around these homes by MP vehicles, including MRAPs that had machine gun turrets. And to assist in the air assault operation, Su-34s had meticulously dropped heavy ordnance and strafed the area, resulting in these neighborhoods being completely smashed. This area right here, adjacent to this neighborhood in particular, of on-base housing, was a golf course that was now partially turned into a minefield of anti-personnel mines. Same was the case in this north-central portion, slightly off the map and on it, adjacent to this particular foxhole machine gun emplacement. Here was a machine gun emplacement. This one right here was to watch through this area over the minefield, whereas these 2 had interlocking fields of fire, and these 2 here had interlocking fields of fire. It was very difficult to have interlocking fields of fire in the neighborhood full of rubbled homes itself, because of the reason that the rubble was obstructive. So what was instead decided on was to send some of their operations troops forward and to use the rubble as fighting positions. As this was occurring, the CH-901As began to arrive. Fire missions were called upon the dying out MP attack carried out by a small platoon-sized element of the 1st of the 354th MP Brigade, who were attempting to come through this area but were hit by artillery fire and fired at from the heavy machine gun mounted armed quad-legged robots, as well as small arms fire from the troops, and also tube-fired barrel-mounted grenade launching systems, which were 35mm barrel-fired grenades beneath of the QBZ-95 or QBZ-03 rifles operated by these troops, and machine gun fire from the Type 67 general-purpose machine guns, as well as the W-85 heavy machine guns. Each of these foxholes had one of each mounted on a tripod. They vigorously monitored their sectors And their reconnaissance drones, their quadcopter recon drones, already now spotted the next group of cadre and trainees moving into the area, including some of their logistical vehicles, and even some further back in this area where these battery buildings are that are completely now cratered ruins from the missile strikes from cruise and some tactical ballistic missiles earlier fired into the area while they were off training. They did eliminate some of the batteries of trainees that were in different phases of training, some of which their training just revolved around stuff they did day to day at these battery buildings. Some of them were eliminated outright by the missile strikes, and some of the very limited artillery strikes that originated in this area, as this road runs completely around these buildings that trainees had. Up here was a PX or essentially a store for the trainees mainly, and also fast food places. There was a troop medical center and more. They were already destroyed by some artillery fire early on. Again, very, very small amounts of artillery were used on this area in conjunction with the enormous amount of missile fire from tactical, ballistic, and cruise missiles. This area was completely pockmarked and in ruins. While this area here had a fence around it, as this was the eastern gate into the trainee part of the post, the training parts of the post on this side, and this was the western gate into the permanent party main post, although there were facilities near the airfield that supported the activities of the TRADOC aspects of the installation, such as where new recruits went to get measured for their Class A uniforms and other such facilities. And the Henry Army Airfield itself even participated in the training flights that occurred with the T-38C Talon supersonic trainer aircraft that flew out of Wichita Falls, as oftentimes the training flights would land here and then fuel up and fly back to Wichita Falls to the Shepherd Air Base. But now that it was captured, this would be used as a installation, this airfield in particular, as an installation to import logistics and rotate in troops and more such activities, including drones and others, by the PLA, as would the same be occurring with the Southeast Corner Airfield. As this occurred, the first artillery fire missions came down to hit the forces that were gathering just off the map in their assembly areas, although some of them survived and began to carry out their attack as ordered, because they didn't want the entire attack to be destroyed before it even got off the ground, as by this point, dozens of troops were being eliminated, as they tactically had decided to spread out their forces some and not concentrate them too tightly, except for when they were carrying out their beginning of their attack, because they had to pass under the interstate in two different places, one being between the eastern and western gates, because it was a highway underpass. It went under this highway. As this part was elevated, where this brown shows, it starts to become elevated, and they ran through this way, and they ran up through this one where there's no entry or exits from the highway, and hence no need for fencing. They charged one prong here, and down in the south there was another human wave assault even further off the map under another segment of interstate. But because this one had fences due to the fact that it was an entry and exit point from the interstate, they charged through this way here to support the more tactical groupings that were now bounding and covering over the interstate, where it was more at ground level and could be charged over. As this was occurring from 4:30 and onward, this action up here against this small group of MPs occurred early on, with artillery strikes eliminating them in conjunction with the fire. And the trainees and the cadre tried their best they could to try to coordinate their attack with that small attack of the MPs after their first MP attack failed and was destroyed, although that wouldn't matter. And the mortar fire from the 82 millimeter mortars firing at the edge of their range at the start of this battle and didn't really have time to maneuver closer and emplace themselves to follow-up fire, because as it stood where they were firing from in the northeast corner of the Fort Sill Lawton Airport was just close enough to hit essentially what amounted to half of the attacking force anyway. So while they were already occupied with launching spoiling attacks on these troops off map to the south that were attacking the other parts of the perimeter, and these troops here attacking, they were launching spoiling attacks to eliminate as many of them as possible, in conjunction with the artillery hitting and destroying these logistical vehicles carrying ammunition, medical supplies, and other assets. These were destroyed right off the bat as the artillery strike with these buildings occurred, where the MPs were firing from these buildings. So essentially what happened was you had the forces here, from here and down south, being pummeled by 82 millimeter mortars, CH-901As, and FPV drones fired, or launched rather, from this FPV drone section right here, moving into the area with this regular section of operators behind these barely intact, albeit hole-ridden buildings adjacent to the runway, as early on cruise and tactical ballistic missiles had struck multiple key buildings along the airstrip itself, leaving very few relatively intact, with the roof still over them being the case, with giant holes in their walls from where the blasts threw debris and shrapnel from relatively closer distance into them, which gutted parts of these buildings. These forces, before they began to be destroyed by the mortars and the CH-901As with HE warheads and the FPV drones, had a group of 5 cadre firing a Mark 19, which was the belt-fed grenade machine gun. And the Mark 19 rounds just started to do a little bit of damage before all of these munitions hit and destroyed them with their MRAPs, because they had several MRAPs, few LMTVs to bring forward supplies up to these troops. And these troops were trained enough in their training cycles to know how to do wedge formations and such. So they were already formed up and ready to cross the highway to attack this area, although this area had a segment of a minefield planted at it already and interlocking fields of fire between these machine gun emplacement foxholes. Only to their north, just outside of the mortar range, could the forces attack in their formations, with 70 of them in this area being completely eliminated between the vehicle-based forces and the dismounts, including even an ATV operator still in the area on a Gator ATV, which was there just in case for some reason they lost communications again and decided to use that as a means to spread information if worst came to worst. But they were destroyed by the mix and match of all the fire, as it was very heavy and potent. Although they fired their Mark 19 and it destroyed one of the quad-legged robots and hit this building and eliminated even 2 operators, it splashed short of this foxhole, and 1 man was wounded in the foxhole, but 2 operators were actually killed in part of this section, and they lost one of their heavy machine gun armed quad-legged robots by the fire, but they didn't get to fire it long enough to do much more than that because they were immediately overcome by munitions. Just to their north in these housing neighborhoods, there was a massive, massive fight already underway, as these forces left the area right before there were about to be artillery strikes called in, which ended up being put on hold because these forces were now moving and the shells would have landed on empty ground. And they were being monitored by drone the entire time, and as they were moving into position, they were using the rubble piles to the best of their ability to try to stay behind, although this squad on the very end down here of trainees and a cadre member leading them bounded to this rubble pile that used to be a home in this neighborhood here. Before trying to bound, they'd already been hit by mortar fire, and a few of the trainees had been cut down, with the rest of their troops bounding out from behind it and over top of it slightly, only to find that as they ran across the street, they were shredded by the machine guns from this foxhole as well as this armed robot, which they tried to fire back at but failed. And as they fired at this trench, they hit nobody, or this foxhole, they hit nobody. And they were completely cut down, as this arrow surrounded by red indicates. These forces, again, having taken up position in part of this smashed housing neighborhoods adjacent to the airfield, were already well established in rubble. And on either side of these rubbled streets, as this squad here was and this squad here, with this one hiding in rubble and this one hiding in rubble, they fired back as these forces bolted into the area and cut them down as they approached little by little, and as they bounded and covered from behind rubble to other rubble, caught them largely while they were still bounding across the streets, with the last grouping of this one moving around here, getting cut down by tossed hand grenades as well as small arms fire, with this one here even being hit by a flamethrower in conjunction with this machine gun equipped robot, although this robot was managed to be taken out. And this group here was cut down by this machine gun wielding bot. Their fire against this robot ended up basically eliminating it. I was looking for the right word. As this force here moved into this area, they too were cut down by the very same machine gun fire, small arms fire, tossed hand grenades. And these half squads, one squad each here, this is being a squad in half squads behind rubble, they did the same up here to these attacking forces here. Now, even as they were moving across, they were still being engaged by a whole slew of different weapon systems, from ground-based weapons, although at the time they were carrying out this attack, partially why they were even able to get this far against these forces into this rubble heap that used to be a neighborhood before Su-34 and missile strikes hit it. The human wave part of the attack was already launched. Again, when I show these map segments, so many things are happening all at the same time. It's difficult to put them in any real order, but as these forces on the end of trainees and cadre who had more training, and of course the cadre having more experience, launched their attacks, supported by this M250 cal group of cadre, now moving into this rubble-piled home to support the rest of their attacks going on in this area. These forces launched their human wave assault, and through sheer strength of numbers, approximately 80 troops right here, in addition to 20 additional dismounts, or 25 if you count this section right here. This section was firing their machine gun just before these troops got into position, but then they had to stop because they didn't want to have any friendly fire incidences. So as these troops moved into position, this massive human wave assault was underway. But by then, this FPV drone force had launched all their FPV drones, a total of 10 FPV drones in conjunction with CH-901A loitering munitions, and the trainees literally running into a minefield unbeknownst to them of anti-personnel mines in this segment right here. Although this segment wasn't even touched, as they never attacked here because they were all wiped out on this side of the interstate. These forces all worked in concert between all of the small arms fire coming from these entrenched in the rubble troops of this squad here, firing at these human wave assaulting forces here, as this section went around to try to outflank these forces. And the sheer force of numbers, even though they ran through the minefield and started losing guys immediately as these FPV drones took out this section and this section by the time it got here, in conjunction with the ground-based fire from this advancing squad trying to shore up their defensive positions in this corner right here. As all these forces were already under heavy fire, and this M250 cal has moved up to support the attack in this area, although it was failing. As these forces were under heavy heavy fire in this area. Most of the focus of the FPV drone operators and CH-901As was focused on these two charging human wave assault areas. This was an enormous fight up in this exact corner linchpin of the defenses. As this foxhole fired, as soon as these two squads bounded to more safe, more suitable, more tenable positions, this one to assist in supporting this foxhole here, and this one behind their machine gun nest to fire from above it while they fired from below it. These forces continue to be hit by FPV drones, CH-901As, and some that scattered out into the rest of the minefield were being blasted by mines. And so bad were these attacks between these two human wave assaults from this large group here. Remember, there were 550 total troops operating in this part of the attack coming in here, as well as the more tactically moving forces of the better trained trainees moving in. The huge number of loitering munitions was utilized in this area, with there being a grand total of over a dozen being used in just this part alone, with flamethrower fire now being utilized by this flamethrower-equipped FPV drone squad, as they had a flamethrower man with a Type 74 flamethrower, along with the same already having had occurred to the south with the flamethrower that was utilized against the troops moving right here in this neighborhood. The same was going on up here, and another batch of FPV drones was sent to stymie and blunt this attack with a lot of machine gun fire, as the advancing arm of this force of human wave assaulting trainees now broke up into four from its original one and then two, now broke into four, with this prong here becoming two prongs and this prong here becoming two prongs, where they were finally completely destroyed, as they had been being engaged ever since they came from under the interstate. They were being fired at the whole time, which is why this arrow is covered in red, although there were huge numbers of them being KIA'd from back here. And as they reached this point, they were still being KIA'd, and even as they split into two, as others were now running over the corpses of their fellow trainees, they began to attack this particular entrenched position of the Type 67 general purpose machine gun and W85, with this one firing at this group right here, as these forces had moved into this area and they were being supported from this angle by these machine gun emplacements, whereas the other W85 machine gun was firing this way, the Type 67 was firing this way through the gap in their line up this street right here. As these special operators were very proficient shooters, and a lot of their activities were guided, in fact, by their ISR dominance, and were using their robots to the fullest, even though they lost eventually another armed one here to all of these trainees just flooding this area. The combination of flamethrower usage, heavy machine gun fire, and general purpose machine gun fire from heavy and general purpose from here and general purpose from here, as well as small arms fire, flamethrower usage, FPV drones, and loitering munitions and mines simply ate these attacking forces up, and they were completely annihilated bit by bit, all of them, as these attacks were badly thwarted. And as this portion, this one platoon here of this last battalion, of the 2nd Battalion operating on the whole other side of the perimeter, landed, so bad was the situation in this particular area, so much of an emergency was it, that their troops forming diamond formations outside of their helos, and the door gunners of the helos as they were about to depart, fired also into these forces, as the troops from this squad here moved behind the machine gun nest here with this half squad here. This squad moved up here on this side of the road before bounding and covering, along with this robot moving in behind to shore up defenses to help support these guys in this machine gun nest is they actually were they had lost 3 personnel by this point. They lost 3 people in this one. They'd already lost a few guys here, an armed robot, and they lost personnel far to the south at the opening when these guys fired a few of their Mark 19 rounds into this area. There were casualties in this fight, even though these were Special Operations Forces. The sheer weight of the numbers used against them in concentrated in specific areas, like right here in this corner, as well as even to the south and another part, it produced casualties. But all in all, the casualties were extremely light. And they did lose some of their quad-legged robots, but the sheer force of numbers couldn't match the tactical fighting abilities, the machine gun emplacements, the minefields, the CH-901A loitering munitions, which had a field day at this engagement, along with the FPV drones, door gunners on transport helos, and the vast array of numbers of robots and small arms and machine gun fire. They just couldn't match it. And even though they had tiny, at first, tactical success, even being able to move in and reestablish a machine gun position in this area here, their forces were all engaged and nullified by drones, by small arms fire, by flamethrowers, by heavy and light and even general purpose and between machine guns. Vehicles were destroyed by HJ-08 anti-tank missile systems, such as indicated by this encapsulated arrow in this surrounded vehicle, as well as the troops charging being just cut down by the combo of drones, loitering munitions, and FPV, all directed by the ISR assets and reconnaissance drones of the PLA. And there was also a superior number, 2 full battalions of the PLA Special Operators, their level of experience and training, and their weaponry used, and even artillery being lent to them, artillery support being lent to them in the form of one of the PLL 66 batteries from just one artillery battalion, with all the rest of the artillery focused on the other combat elements being cleaned up throughout the entire rest of the fairly large installation. This was still enough to completely obliterate these forces. Again, these were trainees. They had no experience, but they had numbers. And numbers was the only reason, and as well as cadres that had some experience. Numbers and their more experienced cadre were literally the only reason why they were able to inflict any casualties at all. Because if you have a few hundred people charging at you with small arms, they're going to do something. They might not be able to do much of something, but they're going to do something. Even against people that have some of the best combat experience and training literally in the world, they're still going to do something. And they did, all in all, between them and the MP attack up here happening roughly at the same time, and their earlier attack, which was completely a failure as the artillery destroyed most of them before they even got across the interstate, with the rest of them being cut down. Their recon-in-force attack is what I'm describing, the 200 that attacked before this group of 900 did. The sheer weight in numbers ended up being a reason why the PLA suffered casualties this time around, was because the human wave assaults were simply going to do something. They had to. Even with the full drone support, ISR superiority, the mortar fire in much of the battlefield, including to the south, where that other part of this battle with 350 additional troops to these was occurring, these forces broke through very slightly due to their human wave assaults in certain areas, like right here. Having crossed this street was considered a breach of the defenses, but they were defeated right here between this machine gun emplacement and this rubble pile right here. They were defeated and were not able to get completely into the perimeter where the airfield was. And they had been stopped just in the nick of time. As these forces of this human wave attack here coming down this way were largely tripped up in the minefield, as well as by the FPV drone and all these CH-1 901A strikes, in addition to these tactically moving and then embedded in rubble position squads here, with these even withdrawing to better positions as the human wave assault got in closer, as most of this squad stayed along the same, most of this huge element stayed within the same path through the minefield. They kept coming, and thus this half squad and this half squad had to relocate to better positions, and even as an emergency measure to shore up these defenses, this full platoon of the other battalion on the other side of the perimeter was moved in to shore up defenses, and they were able to completely blunt and destroy the human wave assaults in conjunction with the better, more tactically moving trainees that had more training than these human wave groups did. They destroyed them as well. And through force of numbers, there were some Chi-Com casualties, but all in all, still wasn't anything substantial. And these forces were completely annihilated. And now that they had been annihilated, as this attack lasted from 4:30 a.m. all the way until 5, as it took a lot of time to move on foot doing these types of things, the last portion of this battle would be a small counterattack against the small number of cadre that tried to get out of the area. Would be a counterattack against them after their attack failed and all their trainees and other cadre were deceased. It would be pursuit and destruction of them, with 2 full companies from one of the 2 battalions being dispatched to go after the remainder of the 1st of the 354th MP Bttn, which was only 300 remaining troops after this platoon-sized element was completely destroyed by the combination of artillery and machine gun and small arms fire from this position here. They were now pursued as 2 companies went up methodically, led by their ISR assets, their quadcopter reconnaissance drones, vigorously hunting down the now foot-bound MPs, as they had lost all their vehicles to earlier combat. And what remained of them were just foot troops that hadn't, as of this time, been yet eliminated, but they were about to be. As these MP forces, after this battle ended, were being pursued to the north by these special operations companies, 2 of which dispatched from here, from their perimeter, to go and hunt them down. And they would have assistance from helicopter-based combat assets of the 4 different combat helicopter battalions, the 2 attack and 2 armed recon from their own Group Army 77th Aviation Brigade out of the 77th PLA Group Army. That ends this battle. The final part of this battle, as the fighting was now winding up in earnest by 5:30 a.m., final part of this battle would actually be fighting not only in the mopping up of the whatever little bits remained of these once former combat elements in all their former glory, was also fighting going on outside the installation and the testing of a new nasty chemical weapon that hadn't as of yet been mass deployed in a combat situation and was about to be, as a new type of drone had been developed specifically for it. And one of the best units to put this into action was the 77th Chemical Defense Brigade of the 77th PLA Group Army. And they would be utilized against civilians that were regrouping after a failed attack against the headquarters battalion of the Combat Engineer Brigade, the 77th Combat Engineer Brigade. And these chemicals would be tested exactly on them. To a small extent, they were already against 400, but now they were to be utilized again, as this 400 was simply the control group for the test, whereas this follow-up would simply be a further test in order to see how consistent the capabilities of this delivery method was, as in the quadcopter recon drone delivery method. As by the time this battle was fully completed, It was now 5:30 a.m. Special operators had repelled and were now even beginning to counterattack. Whatever even remained of the hundreds of attacking forces combined between the 50 approximately MPs and the 900 cadre and trainees who were desperately attempting to take this airstrip and failed completely and miserably. Although they put up a good effort and they had heart, they were unsuccessful.